Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I try always to start every talk out with a thank you instead of putting it at the end so that you remember that this is the important part. I think any of us doing this kind of work can't do it alone. It just doesn't happen. So thank you to all of you who invited me here and all the logistics to be here, but also a team of people that I get to work with at Castles. We have 15 full-time people and some of my closest colleagues that we build games with, we write books with, etc. So please acknowledge all of them as part of this collective work that we do always. So again, thank you. So today what we're really going to talk about, hopefully here in the next 40 minutes or so, maybe 45, is the interface of two huge areas. My goal is actually to sort of highlight some of the pieces and how these might be relevant, the technology and language interface, and why we need to pay attention to that more than just tech for building tools, right? So why digital communication in and of itself is something we as language teachers need to pay attention to. What that means then for interlanguage pragmatics and interlanguage pragmatic instruction. Also, technology, no technology, relatively void from language classroom and instructed language context. And then in the end, if we think about both of these in the same space, in the same area, what does that mean for us, for language teaching, and even more specifically, language learning? That's where we're going. Hopefully, we touch enough on each of the areas that it makes sense and there aren't tons of questions, but please also feel free to stop if you're saying, what, can you clarify that piece or tell me what you're talking about there? This really is meant to be both a talk about what we're working on, but also helpful for you in those kinds of areas. So let's start. Sorry, I'm going to take these off. They're loud with the microphone. Let's start by talking about technology and the technology language interface. This comes from Hootsuite, some of the national annual growth data on what's happening. This is just around internet users, social media users. You see an increase across the board globally, millions and millions and millions of users. The actual numbers don't really matter. What matters to us as language professionals is the way communication is happening is dramatically shifting. So thinking of technology as a workbook people do online or as a flashcard vocab app isn't actually doing the trick, right? We actually have to think about ways in which we can prepare our learners to work in contexts like this, right? Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, YouTube, it doesn't really matter, again, what those specifics are. The reality is this is changing how we interact. I just bought a house. We're in the middle. We have to gut it and redo it, right? Instead of sitting down with a magazine, what does my designer say? Hey, have you ever used this new app, House? Make sure you grab it, pull some pictures, and share your profile with me so we can look at the paint colors you like, right? It's no longer sufficient to have a completely analog world. Simultaneously, the idea that things happen online and then happen offline is really a false dichotomy, right? The reality is things just happen, right? And so what do we do with that and how does it work? It's really, really interesting for those of us who study pragmatics or the way meaning is communicated. As a simple example, I pulled this morning just to check and see, hey, what's happening today around hashtags? We have obviously a changed climate in which hashtags are becoming more and more important. I just Googled how to create a hashtag strategy, right? 62,000 results. 62,000 instances in Google search on how to create a hashtag, right? This in and of itself is the fundamental way language expresses meaning. How many of you have taught hashtags explicitly in your classroom in the last 6 months? Oh, one, yes! So happy. Right? We fundamentally, now, am I saying we only do hashtags? Absolutely not, right? We still need all of the structures and lexicon and all of these pieces, but we have to start thinking about, oh, how are our students using language? To bring a fun example, there's been lots of bad examples lately. I'll bring you this one. If you want to watch the whole thing, I'll let you do that. It's called The Antisocial. I will warn you, there's quite a bit of sort of profanity and social media dating lingo in there. It's really funny. The point is, right, it's a whole idea of a modern day horror story about someone who isn't on social media and how could I possibly date someone I can't check up on, right? And it's funny to us, right? Why is it funny? Because the fundamental way we interact with human beings now is this online-offline interface, right? Many of us love to avoid it. Many of us are there all the time. Some of us are somewhere in the middle. But the reality is, quantitatively and qualitatively, the way human beings are interacting is changing and language is changing, right? This is a more serious note. Let's see if I pull this off of here. I just read this article yesterday because I was so interested. Everyone know what Alexa is? It's Amazon's new Echo. So Alexa is the artificial intelligence agent that runs Amazon's person, Google, Echo, whatever we want to call it, right? You say, hey, Alexa, turn on the lights, and the lights on your house come on. You say, Alexa, order me some toilet paper. It shows up in your house 24 hours later. If you're in Atlanta, it's like 2 hours later, I think, these days, right? But this came up, and I kept thinking about it. Again, a New York Times article, feel free to check it out. Machines will make a raft of decisions for my kids and others like them as they proceed through life. In this case, I'm worried, right? Co-parenting with Alexa. And as I was reading this, happened to be my 4-year-old, walks over to my Alexa, and she says, hey, Alexa, tell me a joke. Right? And you start to see her interact, and I'm like, whoa, wait, what? But you start to see us interacting with technology in different ways. Is it all good? Absolutely not. Is it bad? Not necessarily. It just is, right? So our goal as language educators, I believe, is to prepare our learners to encounter meaning, to encounter people, to encounter the world in ways as which it actually is, right? Something we sometimes forget, especially in instructed language learning contexts, which requires us to rethink not only sort of how we're teaching or the way we address it, right? But the reality is the internet has qualitatively transformed everyday communication and constitutes a multiplicity of language contact zones that is unprecedented in human history. If you haven't read this article yet, I highly recommend it. Looking at all different kinds of context of this text space. So that brings us, or maybe this came from pragmatics, right? That's also something fundamentally missing from the language learning context in which we are working. This is why I started with technology, actually. So this is what I've always been interested in from day one, right? Pragmatic ability. Pragmatics are our ability to deal with meaning as communicated by a speaker or writer and interpreted by a listener or reader, all of which with technology is often blurred, right? Is texting speaking or writing? Neither, it's just texting, right? But what do we do with that? And then understanding people's intended meanings, their assumptions, their purposes or goals, right? This relates both to the functions we do with language every day around requests, around apologies, around hints, and also then around the skills and strategies you need to use language well, right? You have to pay attention to pragmatics. You actually don't ever know they exist until they get messed up. We do it all the time. Things happen all the time. We have intuition all the time. But we don't understand why this sort of happens until we pay attention to it. Let's take a really easy example. You're at a reception, you meet a new student reception maybe, or a new faculty reception. You meet people new, someone new, they're from somewhere else. You're, hey, nice to meet you, it's been great, et cetera, et cetera. And then you say something like, hey, we should grab a coffee sometime. Or, hey, we should grab lunch sometime. What is the intended meaning of that utterance, often by most dialects of native speakers of English? Anyone know? Saying goodbye. Does it mean you're going to have coffee next week? Does it mean you're going to have coffee next month? Does it mean you're going to have coffee ever? Maybe, maybe not. But it is certainly not an invitation to have coffee. It is a pre-closing that happens very formulaically in the data. Now, if you're a learner of English, coming to the United States for the first time, and no one's ever taught you anything other than the structure of, I'd like to have coffee with you, do you understand that meaning? No idea. So what happens? All of these American people are inviting me for coffee and no one ever follows through. Right? It's true. The problem is they're not lying, right? And the problem is there's a misinterpretation of pragmatic intent. Likewise, if you go to often a Spanish-speaking country or certainly a Chinese-speaking country and someone invites you for coffee, you better expect to go next week. Don't say yes unless you want to go. Right? And so the mismatch happens both ways. There's no value in either one of those. But the trick is that until we're explicitly taught those things occur, we don't actually even know it. Right? The orientation of a request, for example, in some dialects, in some languages, has to be here-oriented. You need to do this for me, forgive me, excuse me. Whereas in some languages, it has to be speak-oriented. Because the way you ask changes the imposition of what's happening. Again, all void from the majority of language classrooms. I promise we'll get back to technology in a minute. Let's do a little exercise, and Max has seen this once, but maybe we'll see if it changes his behavior. It's such a simple one when we're talking about technology, so we do it kind of all over the world. So I want you to take about 30 seconds, and I want you to make a list of the 5 best ways to end an email. How do you close an email? The 5 best ways to end an email. In English, we'll just do English for now. Best regard. Yep, any of those. Make a list of 5 closings. Have a great weekend. Thank you. You can just write them down. Maybe nothing. All right. Now, as I've said before, sort of dangerous thing to do, but get out a device. And momentarily, I want you to open your email without getting lost in the messages that are in there, all of the new messages, all the important things that we all haven't answered. And I want you to look at the first 10 emails you've sent, or the last 10 emails you've sent. In English. And how you closed them. All right. Everyone done that? How many of you have the exact same 5 in your email and on your list? Oh, how many of you thought of different things and say different things? Yeah? What are some of the most common ones? Anyone have thanks? Anyone have best wishes? No, best? Anyone have nothing, just like your name with the signature? Some of us write that, right? Ah, there is? The reality is our intuitions about pragmatics, what we think we should do and what we say people should do when we create instructional materials and what we actually do are quite different. They have a lot to do with our identity. It has a lot to do with how we engage and co-construct interaction in those social spaces. I don't agree with her, but Rebecca Greenfield of Bloomberg News tells you, I'm not going to play the video. If you want to check it out, you're welcome to. She will tell you if you use best or best wishes, you are a shallow person and not sending meaningful emails. So she makes all kinds of judgments about the kind of person you are based on 2 tiny little words. Right? The reality is no one actually does anything the same ever, really. Right? We have formulaic sequences, we have ideas, and the way technology is evolving, the reality is probably in emails we use it for much more formal communication now than we used to even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Thorne and Payne, Cultures of Use model starts to look at those pieces, right? So we have to figure out then, what do we do with these pieces? And often, we can identify it this way, right? Pragmatics is a fundamental component of language teaching and learning. I don't know that any of you would argue with me in that particular point. The crux is what? I hear you, Julie, but what do I do? I have 30 students with all different personalities. I'm only me. I have my perception of the world. There are all these dialects, all these cultural assumptions, all of these things about how none of it's ever the same. So how do we assess it? How do we teach it, and what do we do with these pieces? It's not about a hypothetical cultural reality, right? Comprehending a form of cultural pragmatics and understanding how the cultural is created in complex situations. In other words, it's a language skill our learners begin to develop that allows them to encounter any context or any dialect and make pragmatic steps, right? It's a dance. The very first website we ever built was called Dancing with Words for a reason, right? It's sort of, you know the basics, you kind of know the patterns, but then what do you do with them? The reality is it's really hard, right? There's tons of variety. I mean, just in the Spanish-speaking world alone, right? Just in one city. In the city of Atlanta, we could probably find 10 dialects of English, right? Or at least sociolects of English of how they work together. What do we do with that? Individual perception. We all have ideas about what counts as polite or rude or what we want to do with that. We all choose to interact in that space differently, right? And everything about interaction is dynamic and co-constructed, right? It also has to do with the person you're talking to, right? You negotiate things like inside jokes when you know someone better, right? You don't know someone as well. There's now a shared political reality in the United States that changes the way presuppositions are happening, all kinds of things. And then as a result of this sort of inherent difficulty, what we see throughout the literature is a lack of theoretical support in our course design. We have this intense focus on micro level versus macro level. In other words, we test vocab and grammar. It's what we test generally in the United States. Even things like the OPI, things like Apple, things like STAMP, big national level proficiency tests do not account for language variety of some varieties of that particular language, right? Therefore, we're not really bringing in all of these different pieces. We're saying there still is sort of this one set of standard language. Also, we just don't have very much time, right? The reality of a language classroom is that it's really, really difficult to fit everything in as we go. And then also limited expertise, although I think we're starting to gain expertise in terms of pragmatics, both in preparation courses and as well in some of the materials that we see. So what we've done is we've come up with a model, or I've been working on a model to think about how do we do this more systematically. Much like we used to think about input, interaction, output, very similar in that sense, right? Observe, analyze, and extend. If you're able to see the patterns in some way, you can then figure out what those patterns are, and then you're hopefully able to extend that to some particular space. What that means, though, is we have to target our learners at what they should observe, right? For example, in the majority of textbooks in almost any language, what happens when you learn how to say goodbye? What do you learn? Anyone know?
Just
the words. So in Spanish, what do we see? Adios. Ciao, adios. That's it. I don't know. In other languages, it's somewhere you have the sequence, right? The lexical item for what you see. What's the reality in many languages about saying goodbye? Anyone know? Exactly. And it's really, really hard to leave. In many, even in many parts of the US, different dialects of English, it's hard. You actually have to have a pre-closing well before, either 3, 4, 5 sometimes, well before you ever hit that ending, adios or ciao or bye or see you later, right? Hey, I better get going now. Yeah, totally, let's start walking. And then you walk towards the door, and then what happens? Oh, I got to tell you this story. Da, 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 da. 20 minutes later, oh, I really got to get going. What do? You step a little closer to the door, right? We rarely explicitly teach that in our beginning level courses when we teach the lexical items goodbye, right? What's really great about it is if we actually start embedding tiny little pieces of pragmatic instruction that first day, all of a sudden we've primed them to pay attention to patterns, right? Your words are one important piece of that pattern, certainly. This is not at the expense of the kinds of things learners have to know, right? Accuracy matters. There's still a difference. But when you start paying attention and saying, hey, see if you can find ciao, or see if you can find goodbye in this goodbye sequence. Oh, by the way, what else do you notice? You don't understand any of the words, but what else do you notice? right? Those tiny sort of little pieces actually gain us a great deal in terms of helping learners exchange meaning and pay attention to the kinds of things that really matter in terms of building relationships. What I did, and where we get back to the technology interface, is said, awesome. Digital technologies themselves are inherently designed to deal with this complexity. Full disclosure, I was not a gamer growing up. I wasn't even allowed to play video games except one day a week. We didn't own a game console. We rented it at actually like a video Blockbuster rental store, right? So it's not I actually didn't even know how to play games until I started working on this stuff, really. But as I was digging into the literature and as we started thinking about, so these are all these inherent difficulties with pragmatics, which is what I really, really care about in the language pedagogical space, right? How do people interact with each other without negativity, right? Or when there is negativity, stopping and saying like, oh, we might have just had a miscommunication, not an actual anger space, right? Was actually then looking at the digital game space saying, wait, these spaces are designed to do this. They're designed to create agency and variety and lead towards success, right? They're designed to build in just-in-time feedback that's meaningful and individualized in a way that me as a teacher in front of 30 Spanish students can't do. Right? Even when we're in group works or small pair, you can't give feedback right then to every single person at the level they need. Games do exactly that. That's actually the only reason they're fun, right? Is because you get the perfect state of really difficult with good feedback and good scaffolding, really difficult. Also, we knew we could build context excuse me, by creating emotional connection. We can create spaces in which the physical, verbal, gestural, everything is happening and you feel it, right? A lot of the psychology research bears out that people actually connect with virtual characters just as well as they can with other human beings. Again, good, bad, indifferent at that moment. What I'm interested in is I want a space where they care about the person they're talking to, right? I want you to be worried when your avatar's mad at you because then you have to switch your pragmatic attention. And variation, right? We can actually put a bunch of people with a bunch of different language varieties right into the game itself. So I started studying games, and that's sort of where we're at now. Not going to talk about all 6 of these projects, but I wanted to show all of them to you really as an evolution of this kind of work. So Croquelandia was the very first game I ever built. We built a huge virtual world. It has requesting and apologizing in Spanish, lots of data from that I'll sort of summarize, we'll see about time. Then we dig into Mentira, which is an augmented reality mobile game. It really was designed to, instead of digitally creating these spaces, we actually take learners out into neighborhoods, and they have to find clues and interact. That then led to at Oregon, our first game was around pandemic survival. There was a first-year reading that all the freshmen had, all the first-year students had to read. And so what we had them do is think about pandemic survival. We built this game out in 5 different languages, started in English, which is what the book is written in, and then built it in Japanese, Chinese, French, German, and Spanish. And we said, awesome, what's the problem? Because they all reacted, right? And that was the exact point. We translated the game for you perfectly. Why doesn't it work? Well, in Japan, when this happened, you never have a choice whether you could evacuate or not. You have to do language differently. Well, of course, right? Context, behaviors, everything is different. And so the whole idea was to rethink what those kind of socio-pragmatic behaviors would be in situations of crisis or survival. So when they are abroad, the next game was an earthquake survival game, right? In Oregon, Japan kind of matters. So we bring students from Japan, they work on quake survival, looking at that. Those are sort of the design and development projects looking at all kinds of data about what works, what doesn't work, what makes pragmatic salient enough or not salient enough. To be totally honest, Croquelandia is 120 hours of game analysis that told us it didn't work. It's great. That's the fun part of doing this kind of work, right? The problem was then, well, why didn't it work? And really diving into the fact that actually I was too much like a teacher. I was not enough like a game designer. Based on that data, what John and I started doing, what Chris and I started doing was everything we could about game design. How is it different than being trained as a language teacher, and what can we learn from it? Which is where the bottom 3 projects come from, all of which come out of Castles at the University of Oregon. Games to Teach was a joint project originally started by John Reinhardt and I, now is housed at Castles. VR Germany is a project based on a pragmatics approach to teaching refugees German. In Germany, if we take a purely functional pragmatics approach to a virtual reality in this particular case, can we actually help refugees get up to speed on the things that actually are changing their experience in Germany? What does that look like? And most recently, Lingro to Go, which was just launched last month, around a true functional approach to Spanish language instruction. It'll start with Spanish, 10 derivatives are coming of a bunch of different languages. English is next, then Mandarin, expanding out eventually to Japanese, German, etc. So, what does that mean? Understanding the what. We've looked at all these different ways of thinking about sort of function and intercultural competence, and really have boiled it down to 4 areas. If we have to come up with something to assess, which we need if we're going to put it in instructed context, there's knowledge, pragmalinguistic knowledge. There's analysis skills. You have to be able to look at language and analyze language from a pragmatics perspective, which we know learners in the first week of class can do. We've seen them do it, but we have to prepare them to do it. Subjectivity, we have to give them a space to make a choice. It's really different in the data. We have lots of female learners of Japanese who actually choose not to build in honorifics. They choose not to choose the gendered form, right, of what's going on because they don't like where it places them in that culture. There's a big difference between knowing how and making that choice and actually just not doing it because you don't know how to do it, right? And we have to figure out what the difference is. And finally, awareness, just understanding sort of the bigger picture. So the real question then is how, right? What we know is the affordances of digital technologies allow us to do that. We've talked about that. We can validate them. We can scale them. Lingro to Go is designed to be scaled to hundreds of thousands of students at one time and get pragmatics in classrooms as soon as possible. I'm going to skip. I just wanted to show you some of this data. This is the kind of work that we sort of dig through when we're building and trying to figure out what to do to these spaces. Again, I told you Croquelandia is a bunch of things that don't actually work, right? Minimal impact, little impact. We actually see some work around participant roles and design of games helping us a little bit. But mostly it was how do we make this more salient and what do we do with these pieces? Mentira and Ecopod, similar types of data that we dig through, looking at both player data, looking at perception data. We knew that place mattered, right? So what we found was the more we can create these fictional stories and get people out into neighborhoods, the better off we are, and that mobile is doing that anyway. The real takeaway lesson from Mentira and Ecopod isn't necessarily what games you build, but that the reality of getting learners away from books and an abstracted version of language changes everything fairly drastically. Things like Duolingo, Busuu, I don't know, we could go on where you translate and use flashcards are exactly antithetical to the kind of thing we're trying to make happen, right? So our goal is to sort of switch that up a little bit. So, which brings us to Games to Teach. Any one of you can go here, you can download any of this. It's all free, it's all available to use. That's part of how a Language Resource Center works, which is one of the reasons I love being there. This happens to be a blog post about Parable of the Polygons if you haven't worked on it. If anyone's working on social justice type issues, this talks really about the mathematical equation of segregation and how it happens and how you perceive the other and what does that mean. And then what does it mean when you're multilingual and multicultural. And so it leads into those kinds of discussions. But there are many, many other units. Basically what they are a set of classroom activities that you can download and use around relevant social issues and pragmatic issues in a huge variety of languages at 3 proficiency levels. So we give you 2 activities around the national standards, 2 at the novice level, 2 at the intermediate level, and 2 at the advanced level. For each game, there are about 40 pages of game-related activities and things that you can work with, much of which is pragmatics related directly. So anyone who wants to check those out, I always just bring it up because I think it's a nice place to start. If all the rest of this you're like, no way, this is one place that's a really helpful sort of introduction to these kinds of issues. VR Germany is most interesting in that it required us to really think about everything we knew about language learning. We don't know, right? The majority of the research in second language acquisition and teaching comes from college classrooms and from learners who are already literate, already often well-educated. Not always. I mean, of course, we have some high school classrooms. We have some alternative contexts. But the reality is we didn't know. Right? So all these questions were, what does this happen? Well, it's not classroom intervention, right? It's kind of social service, but we're actually not sending people into camps, really, or into houses. It's community reframing of the learning experience, but it's also sort of addressing different pieces. And so in this particular case, what we did is we actually dug in and tried to understand the needs, right? We looked at the current curricula. There are 19 programs currently really well-versed in Germany, teaching German. We looked at policy and resources. We did site visits. We went into housing spaces. We interviewed refugees. We interviewed teachers. And we did some survey and user testing really around these 5 questions. What's available to refugee populations right now, and why isn't it really working, right? Or is it working, and maybe it is? Who are the real target users of this? How are refugee populations currently using technology? I should note, when we say refugee populations, imagine what we're actually talking about, which is probably hundreds of different personas with different archetypes, different experiences. And so cautiously interpreting what would that look like to build a curriculum for people with many, many different needs. And then who are the advocates and adversaries in this space? What we found is there's some relevancy missing in terms of language content. There's very minimal pragmatic and cultural content, very minimal strategic content. There's some spaces for meaningful interaction. We looked at multimodality, transparency, coherence, feedback, level of guidance for the user. All of these should feel like familiar constructs about what we want in language classrooms, right? Here's what we found. In analyzing all of those programs, 3 of the 19 programs offer content that's relevant for the refugee context. So we're teaching about fancy restaurant interactions to populations who are eating in dining halls and cafeteria and government-provided food, right? There's sort of a mismatch. There's very minimal pragmatic and cultural content. 7 of the 19 programs offer some cultural content about how to sort of be in Germany, what that looks like. 0 of 19 offer any strategic content. Pedagogic method and mechanics, 2 of 19. Multimodality, 8 of 19. Hey, not bad, 42.1%. Transparency, coherence, and feedback processes, 2 of 19. In other words, you never know if you're getting it right or wrong, right? Minimal feedback. And level of guidance for the user in terms of scaffolding, right? So we looked at, is there sufficient sort of scaffolding as they work through? Based on that, then, we designed a VR program in collaboration with a corporation to hopefully address some of those issues, right? Really, right now, what we see are refugee populations learning German in 3 ways. Most significantly, via social media. Not surprising, right? Brings us way back to our original part of this talk. Informal interactions with people, and some formal face-to-face classes, government-sponsored for Syrian refugees, and some are not, so you can only attend those classes if you're sponsored in certain ways. There's a very complicated sort of government space in that. So our goal then was to work on this app, figure it out. We knew the content had to be built specifically for our refugees, had to connect to existing communities, had to work in low latency or non-connective environments, which was kind of a challenge around virtual reality, so a technical challenge on the technical side. Multiple types of users, multiple user sign-in. We distilled it down to 4 user personas, which I don't know that is enough, but that's where we started. And then really designed for those who've experienced a high level of trauma. So all the things we know about video game design isn't exactly what we want to do in some of these spaces, right? You have to be cautious. I can show you a little bit of what that looks like. Here. So it can work with a headset or without a headset, but all around language function and things that refugees are going to need to do while they're there. And so they have to figure out they need certain things from the administrator at the camp to be able to towels and food and things like that. I also want to be really mindful and mention it's not about sort of us going in to save the day. That's totally the opposite mindset. It's really about what can we learn about language learning in these different kinds of spaces that are different. So we always tried to take a step back from how we thought about these pieces. This would be in a headset, right? So you walk around and it feels like you're actually walking in. You work with avatars, again, around pragmatic functions. If you're too hearer-oriented, in this particular case, Germans much prefer speaker orientation in their requests, then it sort of changes, right? Whereas most Arabic speakers or Pashto speakers actually prefer hearer orientation. And so we sort of switch and we work with some of those functions as you go on. As is the case with many projects, sort of this has ended up, it's being used by certain populations and has now been moved on sort of to the other partner working in that project. But happy to answer any questions about that if people are interested. Key is thinking about pragmatics in different contexts and the types of things that technology can be really good for in addressing. The last piece is an app any of you can download. It's a free app. You can use it whenever, even if you're not teaching Spanish. It gives you some examples around language learning strategies and pragmatics that I think are highly relevant and helpful, hopefully. What's key about Lingro to Go? You can search for it in the App Store. What's key about Lingro to Go is the entire language curriculum is based on pragmatic functions and based on language functions and actually the way language happens. This is just a sample from the scope and sequence. Functions, saying hello to your friends and family, leaving a social event, describing things you like and don't like, telling someone about your typical week, talking about hopes and plans for the future. Then you have a set of lexicon. This is in Spanish. You have a set of functions. You have a pragmatic component that you have to do this function well. And you have a strategy component that may or may not be pragmatics related. Sometimes it's as simple as how to use cognates, right? How to do an internet search term. What do you notice about this particular scope and sequence that kind of maybe looks different than what you're used to? Anything?
Well, are these like per day or is it?
This is per unit, so it really is a self sort of study space. So look at number 4, first person present tense. How many of you ever taught present tense just in the first person? What do? We tend to sort of do the opposite, right? We take the grammar tree or the grammar structure and we place the function on top of it instead of vice versa. The reality is when you're telling someone about your typical week, you'd only need the first person to do that. And so what we've done is we've really tried to distill out. It's meant as a supplement app, so it would complement a course that you're taking anyway, but really tried to distill out meaning is your fundamental piece of this. Right? These are the structures you need so that you don't get sort of lost in the noise of what happens. A really common example is in Spanish, right? How many of you have taught reflexive verbs or most textbooks, my daily routine? If I ask someone, say, hey, what'd you do this morning? Or tell me about your morning routine. Maybe you'd say that. I don't know if you'd ask that. What'd you do this morning before you left the house? What are you going to tell me? Any ideas? That's what our textbooks ask them to do, right? How many of you have told someone your morning routine in the last 6 months? Really? Maybe a roommate if you're trying to figure out bathroom times, right? Maybe like, oh, this crazy thing happened to me this morning. It was the worst morning ever. First I dropped my hair, right? Maybe. What else? Someone says, what do you do in the morning? What do we typically say? Oh, I get up, I get ready, I have some breakfast, I usually read the paper, maybe I do my meditation, maybe I work out, and then I leave the house. Are any of those, in Spanish, none of those are actually reflexive verbs, right? And so the problem is what we've done is we've taken the grammar, and we've sort of placed the communicative function on top, but we're missing likely the authenticity that goes with that function. And so what we've done is we've attempted here, there's 120 lessons, so we've attempted to take these lessons and sort of flip that around and say, here's what people need to do the first 2 years of up to an intermediate mid-proficiency level. These are the functions as outlined by the national standards. Let's work backwards. If you can do all these functions, you get all the same structures, if not more, because you have all the pragmatics pieces. The trick then is sort of rethinking the way we think about meaning. Again, though, it works with any other particular curriculum. Let's see if we can. All right, so what we do is we address this in a number of different ways.
Using hashtags to create meaning. No matter which social media platform you are using, you have to admit that hashtags are #awesome or genial. After all, they can add so much extra meaning to what you're saying. One way they add meaning is by providing some additional context. Are you at the #San Sebastian Film Festival? Or is something new happening right now? Etiqueta ahora? No matter what it is, you can tell people who, what, where, and when with a hashtag simply by adding a word or two. Hashtags also add meaning by facilitating connections. For example, a brand of food can connect itself with a movie by using a hashtag with its title. Individuals can connect themselves with celebrities by using their names with a hashtag. Either way, a sort of digital relationship is created. Another way that hashtags make meaning is by summarizing complex situations. A great example that arose out of the Bolivian water crisis was Etiqueta La Paz sin agua. Another great example, Etiqueta Sin maíz no hay país, came out of the recent Mexican tortilla crisis.
So we use it both to talk about sort of cultural spaces, but learners can watch these on their own. Of course, digging into technology pieces is one piece, but that's not everything. The other thing that we do is we explicitly address the pragmatic components, starting at the first.
¿Cómo estás? Now, what do I say? One of the first phrases many people learn in Spanish is ¿Cómo estás? Along with ¿Qué tal? It's just one of the many ways to say how are you? But before we look at the way people commonly respond to these expressions in Spanish, let's take a minute to think about what you would say in English. Would you instinctively say something like great, fine, or okay? In English, we often use the phrase how are you as a way to simply greet others. There is typically no expectation of a detailed response or any information about how you really feel. In fact, it's often jarring when someone gives a serious or genuine answer. In Spanish, however, ¿Cómo estás? Or ¿Qué tal? Can be answered with both short and long responses. The question is more often than not a genuine inquiry into someone's well-being, and it's quite common for Spanish speakers to respond with additional information that explains their response. Bueno, estoy bastante preocupada. Tengo examen mañana y no he estudiado. Or even a short anecdote about their day. Uf, no te la vas a creer, pero esta mañana mientras preparaba el café. Offering more details is a way to build solidarity or closeness in a relationship and express interest in continuing the conversation. So next time someone asks you, ¿Cómo estás? Don't be afraid to tell them how you really feel and get the conversation rolling. And always expect the same when you ask.
So the goal here is to get them thinking more about ¿Cómo estás? Muy bien. ¿Cómo estás? Muy bien. Muy bien isn't actually the formulaic response we most often see, right? We leave it at that because that's what they're capable of proficiency-wise, right? But a pragmatic sort of component can be something as simple as a video like this or just an explanation. Then the observe stage is go out, look at a movie, see how people answer that question. An analysis stage, maybe giving them examples of actual responses to ¿Cómo estás? Or ¿Qué tal? Where they actually have to evaluate how much information is given, right? So very simple continua that might just have a line. No language production. We're talking day 2, likely, right? Maybe day 1, depending in most language curricula. Also then what the app does, and what we do is we have them dive in, right? So you have all of these functions. You have the videos. You have a bunch of domains. And then you have activities that specifically target the pragmatic component. right? Listen to Estefania speak. How do you know if she's asking about the question about you or about someone else? And so we really focus in on those pieces. They can learn different pieces. This one is figuring out if it's similar to ¿Cómo estás? Or not similar. We want them to look at dialect variation. And so there's a video on recognizing dialect. And so they have to sort and work with those pieces. Again, the app itself is just sort of one way to scale this type of instruction because we're all really, really busy and don't have time to create a bunch of new things. So welcome to use it. But really it's about putting functional pedagogy, pragmatics-based pedagogy, starting from beginning levels and what we do with that and how we work with that as we go through. That's sort of our latest project right now. We're in the process of both finishing the development but also diving in. If you have the app, if you don't have the app, does it change? Right? What does explicit pragmatic instruction using these sort of technological spaces do or not do? And we'll see how that goes, right? About the data. And at that point, I think we're pretty close to the time for the talk, but leaving lots of room for questions and discussion. And happy to talk about any of the 6 projects that I mentioned earlier or anything else for that matter. So thank you.